TikTok admitted this week, they begrudgingly admitted that tens of thousands of their most outspoken users in Romania were largely Russians who were influencing the presidential election there in illegal ways. So over the last several weeks, these extremely active TikTok accounts were aggressively targeting and retargeting Romanian voters ahead of Romania's presidential election. These accounts were often posing as Romanians, patriotic Romanians, and just filling the heads of the real Romanians with all kinds of pro-Russia falsehoods, all the Kremlin's smoke and mirrors. So the Russians were just bombarding these voters for weeks. And they also conducted apparently a very sophisticated cyber attack that allowed them to avoid being labeled on TikTok as a political ad, even though that's exactly what their posts really were. And it worked. It played a significant role in Romania's presidential election. It was enough to help the pro-Russian fringe candidate to win the first round of voting. That is Călin Georgescu. So TikTok has now taken down many of these pro-Russian fake accounts. It took down 66,000 of these accounts, as well as about 10 million fake followers. And those might sound like pretty big numbers, 66,000 fake accounts, 10 million fake followers. But we should keep in mind that those are only the ones that Russia used for Romania's election. And that's only the accounts on TikTok. So if you multiply those kinds of numbers out across all of the countries that Russia is trying to influence and multiply it across all the different platforms, then you start to get a feel for just how much power Russia has bought itself on social media. So when you log into X or YouTube or Instagram or TikTok and you see hundreds of thousands of accounts praising Russia, defending Russia, acting as apologists for Russia and Putin, and at the same time, you see them victim blaming all of Russia's various victims, coming up with hundreds of reasons why Georgia or Moldova or Ukraine should not be helped. You should know that in many cases, this is not really your fellow American or your fellow Briton or your fellow Romanian siding with Russia. When you see Dallas Patriot 543 making these kinds of statements, and you see Florida Girl for Trump making these kinds of statements about how upright Russia is and how corrupt the Republic of Georgia is, that's not really a Dallas Patriot or a girl from Florida in a lot of cases. In many cases, that's Boris in Moscow. And he's on Putin's payroll posing as something that he's not. And he's posting pro-Russian propaganda 10 or 12 or 16 hours a day. And of course, a lot of it is also automated. It's a well-established fact that Putin uses armies of bots to amplify the voices of his real human trolls. And the Russians also run actual news sites as well, like Southfront, sites that look like US kind of alt-right sites. So it's not just social media, but it's actual publications. And then the Russian trolls also spend a lot of time amplifying pro-Russian content from Zero Hedge and InfoWars and in certain Tucker Carlson reports and other pro-Russia Western messages.
Well, it's a bit of like the Zero Hedge, it's a bit of a circular thing because then Zero Hedge take material written by people in the Kremlin employ. There are various different, it's all kind of laundered. I think there's something called like the Center for Strategic Studies. I can't remember what it is. It's got some kind of acronym like that, but you look at it and it's basically Russian government funded, and then that'll be on Zero Hedge. I mean, I think they're a useful news source. I read them quite regularly. I think this is what makes this subject so tricky because in a lot of ways, Zero Hedge will help you find very useful sources that don't get reported by CNN and many of these others. So we need alternative media outlets. But then Russia is able to really take advantage of that need and push some of these other things.
Yes, I fully agree. It's quite a complex situation, but this is a major story, and I think an underreported story, because what it means is that real people, whether they're in Romania or the UK or France or Germany or America, they see these pro-Russian accounts and posts, and they see what appears to be overwhelming support for Russia and overwhelming condemnation of Russia's victims like Georgia or Ukraine or democracy in Romania. And with enough real people seeing that and reading it, many of them are persuaded, especially, as you said, in this age when more and more people are rejecting mainstream media for what are very often very valid reasons. But this development is important because real people end up being won over to a lot of Russian talking points, or at the very least, they get very confused, too confused to be able to recognize aggression. And they start to think that it's all complicated. It's not black and white. It's all shades of gray. There's fault on every side. Some of them just throw up their hands and say, who knows? It's a crazy world. And that also plays into Putin's strategy. And this is exactly why Vladimir Putin spends billions of rubles annually to wage this multifaceted information war against Western nation. He is poisoning the wells of discourse. And it means that many real people are influenced by Russia's propaganda and end up parroting a lot of those same, Kremlin talking points.
This story caught my attention because I was watching the Romanian election. This is big for Europe. And, you mentioned, was it Călin Georgescu, who I probably butchered that. But anyway, he was the surprise kind of going through to the next round of the presidential elections. And we'll still see how he does that. But he didn't campaign at all on mainstream media. Like, his campaign was very much largely on TikTok. So when you've got a whole bunch of Russian bots basically on TikTok, like that won him the election, or at least won him what was a shocking victory. Again, we don't know if he's going to win overall, but he did incredibly well. And he wasn't really in any mainstream media. I mean, we saw, going back to Romania this week, the far-right party has doubled their vote, I think from 9% to 18%. And this is a party that has, I mean, it goes all the way, they've had support for what was basically Romania's version with the Nazis. I think it was the Iron Guard back in the 1930s, the 1940s. And because they're doing so well, Russia's mainstream coalition Romania's mainstream coalition of left and right, they don't have enough support. Like, you're getting to the point where people are very worried that this NATO member, EU member, that's crucial for the eastern flank of NATO and the EU could drop out of the Western alliance and could become this pro-Putin nation. And then a lot of, he can win a massive victory this way with influencing that election. Now, well, two things. I think one, it's deeply ironic given that Russia has said we're going into Ukraine to fight Nazis, to find them backing neo-Nazis, literal neo-Nazis in Romania. I don't know, I tend to be a little bit skeptical that social media really does influence people that much. There is always a part of me that asks, are people that dumb? Like, or don't we just tend to vote for who we're going to vote for, and we listen to people that agree with us? I mean, I don't know. Is there much evidence to show that, yes, there's a lot of bot accounts? Have they really tipped the scale? Or is this just people saying, look, the current leadership has failed. We have one of these bland left-right coalitions in Romania that nobody likes because it never does anything. Like, they never please anyone. Can we see how much of a difference that has made? I mean, that's a very hard thing, I guess, to measure.
It's difficult to measure, but in the case of Romania, the authorities from outside organizations and from inside the country believe that this was very much the deciding factor in that first round of votes. But it's still difficult to quantify it. But
and it's a convenient scapegoat. Like, the authorities are the party of the mainstream left and right that are in coalition. Right. And of course, they're going to say, it wasn't anything we did. It was the Russians. And again, there's no denying that this was going on, but I think they should probably look in the mirror as well as point the finger.
True, but I would say that it's telling that TikTok, which is a Chinese Communist Party run company, was forced to admit that, yes, it had allowed at least 66,000 accounts inside of Romania to behave in ways that were overtly political without being labeled as overtly political. And that's a violation of TikTok's norms or their rules and guidelines. So they kicked these 66,000 accounts off. And I think that right there is an admission that this was quite a successful strategy, or else the Chinese wouldn't have felt compelled to follow through on that. But the Trumpet has actually been warning about Russia's commandeering of internet platforms and the power that they have through this for many years. If you go back to 2018, managing editor Joel Hilliker, he wrote an article called "Wake Up, Russia is Turning Americans Against Americans." And he talks in that article about the 2016 election in the US, especially when Russian trolls were taking over several social media platforms, just working in overdrive to foment hatred among Americans and to deepen the divides. And Mr. Hilliker talks about these Russian trolls actually finding articles on InfoWars and other right-wing fringe sites, stories that were not true. And the Russians expended huge amounts of energy to amplify those stories and promulgate them, all for the purpose of making Americans mistrust their government and mistrust each other and hate their government. Mr. Hilliker also talks about how the Russians were able to actually make a big protest happen in Texas by organizing two clashing protests at the same time. And then he writes, "Shouldn't we feel some shame? Shouldn't this stir some remorse for having let foreign antagonists fiddle with our emotions to turn us against our own countrymen? Shouldn't this be a wake-up call to reunite and redirect our indignation against those who are plainly exposed as trying to sabotage us?" End quote. And then from there, Mr. Hilliker gets into the Bible, and he talks about the true author of deception and the true author of these kinds of divide and conquer tactics. So this article was from 2018, as I said, but from this story in Romania, we see that the Russians have continued to use these same tactics, and they're actually using it more and more, I think, to turn countrymen against each other with propaganda. So I think that this article still has a great deal of relevance. And once again, it's called "Wake Up, Russia is Turning Americans Against Americans."
And I think the spiritual dimension that you bring up, and or that Mr. Hilliker brings up in that article, is a really critical one. Where, again, this is what's going to separate us from even a lot of so-called Christian news outlets. That the Bible makes clear there is a devil, that he does influence the world, that he is the God of this world, and John chapter 8, Jesus Christ himself says, well, he's a murderer, but he's a liar. That he's been a liar from the beginning, that he loves deceit. He like it's a core part of his personality. And that the deceit all around us is a major sign of his influence in the world. And I think that's another big part of this story, because yeah, Vladimir Putin is an evil guy, and he is influenced by Satan the devil, but there's a whole lot of other leaders. I mean, Satan's the god of this world. He's influencing and broadcasting to everyone. You see this with the radical left. You see this with the mainstream media, where there's this whole climate of deceit, and a lot of people don't know who to believe. And I think, you look at what's happening in Georgia, and the way that people are saying, well, Russia stole the election, and that they are bringing about, they're bringing Georgia into the Russian orbit, the country of Georgia there, and that they're taking over Georgia by stealing the election. And I think there's a lot of evidence that that is true. And then you look at, though, people are saying, yeah, but we heard that about January 6th. We were told that, we've been told that Russia stole the US election. And so people kind of discount it because they've been told so many lies that were provably lies about Russia being behind Donald Trump, Russia taking over the United States, and Russia interfering politically in the United States. Like, a lot of that was exaggerated. And so then when Russia genuinely does some of these things in Eastern Europe or in the Caucasus, that kind of gets discounted. And people don't, nobody in the United States has not reacted at all strongly to what's been going on in Georgia, which is very different if you compare that to, say, 2008 and some of the color revolution. America used to be on top of this. And I think it's because of the climate of deceit that has been created by the mainstream media that America isn't really interested in getting involved.
I think one of the few things that Americans, both on the left and right, agree about these days is that we should sort of pull away from being the global policeman. We've started to see that, on both sides of the aisle. Just more isolationist sentiments that are setting in, and less eagerness to try to stabilize what I think Ronald Reagan would have tried to sort of get involved with in places like Georgia. But I did want to quickly mention before we hand it off to Andrew there that the situation in Georgia, it is becoming very violent right now. Right now, these Russian aligned agents are just cracking down violently on protesters there. So Georgia, of course, is a little nation there in the Caucasus that was under Moscow's control for almost 2 centuries. First as part of the Russian Empire, then as part of the Soviet Union. But of course, that all ended in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed and Georgia achieved independence. But Russia has been trying ever since then to restore its control over Georgia. We saw that very dramatically with the 2008 war when Russia conquered a fifth of Georgia's land and made that kind of de facto Russian territory. And now Putin is trying to go even further with that. He recently, I think that the evidence for his having rigged that election there is undeniable. And it was all just to pull Georgia deeper into his orbit. And of course, the people of Georgia are up in arms about this. They're out in the streets fighting for freedom, fighting to avoid becoming the next Belarus or the next Ukraine. These people want to align with Europe instead of Russia. Europe has more rule of law, and so it's more prosperous and it's more free. So it's no surprise that the Georgians want to lean toward Europe instead of Russia. But Putin's agents, they're out there in the streets firing tear gas, cracking heads, doing everything they can to put the protesters down. They're raiding the offices of pro-Europe politicians, arresting many people. So there is fierce fighting on both sides, but it's hard to see how the Georgians could overcome these pro-Russia forces. So we will be keeping a close eye on that conflict.